Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. How did Israel's war on Gaza become one of the defining moments of the 21st century? Let's get to the bottom line. After decades of being swept under the rug and neglected, the issue of Palestinian rights and justice has gone from the back burner to the top of the world's agenda. The attack by Hamas on Israel on October 7th, 2023, and Israel's response has become one of the defining events of the 21st century. And it's had implications far beyond the region, on free speech, on the solvency of international law, on the conversation on racism, the conduct of warfare, and even the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I said it. So how has Gaza changed the world? Today we're talking with author Pankaj Mishra, who's just come out with a new book on the global impact of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, The World After Gaza, A History. Pankaj, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to start out as we talk about the ingredients that got us to where we are at this moment, where the President of the United States is talking about moving 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza and setting up the Riviera on the Gaza. I'd like our audience to understand what has gotten us to this point where we've almost become numb to hearing about ethnic cleansing.
Well, it is an interesting question, isn't it, Steve? I mean, I think, the fact that it's now a president of the United States who is now talking about ethnic cleansing, and Israel, you could argue that it's almost taking a backseat here. They're not so enthusiastic about it. Of course, far-right leaders there have been talking endlessly about the necessity of ethnic cleansing and how they should go about it and how they should finish the job. But, it's never really been kind of explicit state policy in just the way Trump has announced it as U.S. policy to carry out ethnic cleansing. And so if, you ask that question, how did we come to this situation where a U.S. president is more enthusiastic about ethnic cleansing a Palestinian territory, then I think you really have to go back and look at this extremely complicated American engagement with Israel, with Zionism. Some part of that story has been told before, but I think, really the story that we know, which is more familiar to us, is the sort of story of diplomacy and changing, relations between America and Israel at the government-to-government level. But I think the emotional history of this, the cultural history of this, has really only been told in scattered, monographs or scholarly monographs. So this book really is an attempt to kind of, tell the story and make it kind of, in a way, accessible to a wider audience.
I don't know if you agree with that framing that I've given to your book, but I think it's an interesting journey to think that those that were the oppressed, the victims, are now have victims that they're perpetrating these horrors on today in Gaza, in the West Bank, and other parts of the Middle East.
Well, this is a sort of historical irony. You could say it's a, particularly grotesque irony of history that victims of racism, victims of imperialism, turn into perpetrators themselves when they come to wield a certain amount of collective power. And this is the case, I should emphasize, this is the case not just with the people who run the state of Israel today, who claim victimhood, who claim that their ancestors, were viciously persecuted, and that claim is absolutely correct. No community, I would argue, has been as viciously persecuted as European Jews in the first half of the 20th century. And you could, also argue that there are many other communities around the world who can also make pretty accurate claims on this, victimhood. But at the same time, once you constitute a nation state, once your own history begins as a sovereign people, then you have to be judged by what you actually do as a nation state. You can't keep always claiming that particular narrative of victimhood to justify, your sort of atrocities on other defenseless, weak, stateless people, which is what the state of Israel has been doing for a long time. And I think we need to break free of these narratives, whether it's Israel or whether it's India or any other post-colonial country. I think, those countries have to be judged by what they do in the present, how, what kind of values they uphold. This is not really a question of giving endless license to people who commit massacres just because something absolutely terrible happened to their ancestors.
So as you look around the world, where do you have hope? I mean, you try in the end, and I think you fail, to sort of look at what the equation of hope or a better direction would be. Where in the world do you think the values equation is prevailing?
You know, Steve, I don't really invest hope in countries or nation states, you know, the idea of America or the idea of China or the idea of India. I invest hope in generations, you know, and I invest hope in younger generations. Every young generation remakes the world. It remakes it for itself and for its own children and grandchildren. And I think, you know, it's probably safe to say that the generation today that has been exposed to, you know, some of the most horrific scenes human beings have ever witnessed in history, you know, scenes of people being burned to death, scenes of you know, parents carrying the headless corpses of their children in their arms. Young people today have gone through so much in the last 15 months, and I think their immediate response, which is one of shock, outrage, horror, empathy, compassion, this, I think, you know, whatever really, you know, the political consequences of their protests, and we know they have been brutally crushed, not by the Trump administration, but by the Biden administration. So they lie politically passive right now. But what's important is, you know, they saw endless outrages, endless horrors, and they responded. They responded profoundly morally, profoundly ethically. And I think, you know, some of these people might grow up and you know, come into positions of power and influence and retain some memory of the horrors they saw and, you know, the sense of morality they developed back then, the values of compassion, the values of empathy for, you know, our fellow human beings. So this may seem too abstract, but I think that is the hope I would draw from the sort of images we saw of young protesters, young students, young people in general over the last few months. Because we know that the generations that have been in power, in positions of power and influence over the last couple of decades, whether these generations vote for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, have failed us terribly. So we definitely need to look forward to another generation rectifying our moral blunders.
You grew up in India. You grew up, as I understand it, in a Hindu nationalist household. You had tremendous respect for what Israel was doing, what it meant as you were growing up. And you visited Israel in 2008. Can you tell us about that journey and how it changed your course?
You know, I think it's a very commonplace journey, Steve. You know, it's a journey of people, and several books have been written about this, most recently by Ta-Nehisi Coates. People who know very little about Israel or have a kind of uninformed infatuation with it, which is, you know, what I had growing up in India, in a family that revered Israel, that revered Zionism, saw it as a model for India, saw it as a model for the Hindu majority of India. And then you grow up and you discover other facts, you read a lot more, you discover, you know, you encounter Palestinians who tell you another story altogether. And then you go there and then you realize that, you know, this is really one of the most horrific states of military occupation anywhere. And I've traveled a bit. I've traveled, you know, in places where India enforces a military occupation. I've been to various other parts of Asia where, you know, minorities are oppressed by powerful state actors. But nothing had prepared me really for the brutality and the squalor of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. And more scandalously, Steve, I mean, I think the fact that this occupation was consistently denied, obscured by mainstream politicians and journalists in the so-called democratic West. I think, you know, when we look at what is happening in Myanmar or Sudan or various other sort of places around the world, the atrocities there are not being obscured or justified or supported by the so-called democracies. But this was an extraordinary case of, you know, so a kind of colonial style oppression going on in the 21st century. and yet most people didn't want to look at this. Most people did not want to examine it in the West, and also, ask themselves the question: how long can this last? And what kind of world does this portend? And I think we have the answer today.
You mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates. When I was at the Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi was one of my colleagues. Of course, he wrote Between the World and Me, but he's also written a book about Palestine. He's been enormously criticized. I think similar kinds of criticisms have been levied against Ta-Nehisi Coates, against yourself, against the sort of notion that those observing and trying to understand this morally, historically, politically, are not allowed to because of not having gone through the Holocaust. Your thoughts?
Well, Steve, my position is that, suffering has been a constant. It's been a regular experience of countless people around the world especially over the last 200 years, when we've also become more aware of global suffering in various sort of regimes, whether, communist, totalitarian, capitalist, imperialist, indeed, anti-colonial and post-colonial regimes as well. I think to draw particular narratives of victimhood from those and to then claim that, my narrative is superior to yours, that entitles me to do certain things which you are certainly not entitled to do, that is really not the way to create any kind of society where, people share a common purpose or are devoted to, some kind of a idea of common welfare. You're looking at people siloed in their memories, in their particular historical experiences, unable to empathize with the pain and suffering of other people. So, I don't know what these other people who have these positions, what they think about this issue. But what I'm trying to argue in this book, that for democracy, for the idea of compassion for our fellow beings, for that to prevail, we need to move out of these particular narratives of historical victimhood.
Why do you think the kind of words that you've just shared are so controversial? You write about intellectual despotism of these times. You write about censorship. I know that you yourself, I'd love to hear a little bit about it, have paid a price out there for shining a light on the importance of this conversation. Why can't we have this conversation without consequence among reasonable people?
Well, we are living in sort of, I think, what can only be described as morally perverse times. You have the Vice President of the United States defining, a mode of Christianity, which is the exact opposite, really the exact opposite of what Christianity is today. This is a man attacking Catholics in the United States for encouraging illegal immigration or for supporting and protecting immigrants. So this is really an upside down reality we are all inhabiting, where the values that have held human societies together, that have really, in a way, made our lives meaningful, whether those values are of compassion or sort of empathy, those values are being trampled into the earth, and what the value that prevails today is brute strength. That is the value that's being upheld, and we are being told that might is right, and the poor must suffer. It's too bad, but this is how it is. So let's recognize, this extraordinary world that we have come to inhabit, and then try to also understand how we got here.
I want to recount and show you a recantation of what President Biden shared about a conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is Joe Biden speaking. I said, but Bibi, you can't be carpet bombing these communities. And he said to me, well, you did it. You carpet bombed Berlin. You dropped the nuclear weapon. You killed thousands of innocent people because you had to in order to win a war. But many Americans don't remember dropping the bombs on Hiroshima or Nagasaki or many of the other outrageous things this country has done. But does that mean that in the fact that we're not necessarily introspective about some of the crimes, inhumane crimes we have done or others have done, that we can't still have a North Star, towards something that is much more humane and just and fair, particularly in the case of Gazans?
Well, Steve, I think it has to do with, what kind of values you want to privilege. If you think survival, if you think the expansion of power, collective power, individual power, if those are your main goals, then everything is justified in the service of those perverted ideals. Then, of course, mass, extermination is justified. Of course, Hitler made the same kind of arguments when he set about destroying the European Jewish population. This is the kind of argument that all major despots, all major totalitarian figures have made over and over again. We need to do this in order to win something. This is the morality that we are working with here. This is very far away from the morality that has guided most peoples around the world for a long time. We have to look at, what is happening here. Are our nation states innately amoral or even immoral? Is there something about the political and economic systems that we inhabit today that do not take into account a simple, criteria of right and wrong? Have we moved so far away from, our sort of early religious, spiritual, and philosophical prompting that we've become these monstrous creatures who will not stop at, mass murdering tens of thousands of people and following it up with ethnic cleansing, with cleaning the area, turning into a Gaza Riviera? I mean, this is a monstrous world we are inhabiting today. And all sort of, again, justified and invoked by, dubious examples drawn from a very selective history. We would have had Hitler, if Germany had won the Second World War, making the same kinds of arguments about killing 6 million Jews. It's the victors who write this kind of history always.
But as I sort of look at this broad question of Gaza, Palestine, Israel, and you sort of ask the question of, where is this going to go in a way? What are the barriers to what Donald Trump is talking about, essentially ethnic cleansing? Is there any barrier? You identify with the students and others that are protesting, but in a way, I think you kind of almost morosely realize how outgunned, how outnumbered, and how outflanked those that are trying to raise the profile of these questions are. So I'd love to know, as you sort of look at the situation now, do you see anything that is hopeful?
Steve, I said very clearly in the book that it's very likely, and it has become more likely with Trump's victory, that Israel will succeed in ethnic cleansing Gaza and maybe even the West Bank. And that horrific possibility is closer to being realized today. Obviously, Israeli far-right politicians have been wishing, openly proclaiming their desires for this kind of outcome for a very long time. And obviously, October 7 came for them as a great opportunity. And again, they were openly talking about this right from the beginning, that, this is the moment to accomplish many of our, long-defined objectives here. So this is, a moment for them, and obviously they are ecstatic that Donald Trump is supporting their endeavor. In fact, Donald Trump is now in the driving seat in many ways. But I think I would like to point to something else, which is that this progress, it's perhaps easier to describe Israel's trajectory in this context, because I think we are looking at a much more extensive radicalization across the Western world. The kind of sentiment that is now emerging, political sentiment stoked by mainstream politicians, often not just by far-right politicians, against immigrants, against religious minorities. This is something that has been in the making for some time, and I think this kind of moral and legal arson, this kind of bonfire that Israel has lit in the Middle East of norms, law, international morality, just about everything that we decided to make sacrosanct after 1945. I think this process is now beginning to happen in various other parts of the Western world. And we see that most strikingly in the last 2 weeks of the new Trump administration. It is also happening in much more insidious ways in places like the United Kingdom, when Keir Starmer said, the Israelis had every right to cut off power and water to the Palestinians. This is a human rights lawyer speaking, in sort of open violation of every kind of human rights law we can think of. He was preparing the stage for when he becomes prime minister and declares war on some of the poorest and weakest people in the country. We are looking at a much more extensive breakdown here than just, what has happened in Gaza. And it's very likely to happen in the West Bank.
Let me just ask you briefly and finally, Pankaj, I find it so interesting that you're an Indian observer of this, and it's just, I'll tell people it's an extremely powerful and important book, and I want to congratulate you on that. In my book, India is the most significant rising power in the world. China is important, but China's population is decreasing. India's is growing. India's economy is growing huge. India is going to be one of the major norm setters in the entire world, and we look at it. What do you think the government in India is learning from this moment as we see what unfolds with Gaza?
Well, I think it's played its cards badly so far. I think they sort of, in the Indian government, went along with the fantasy that there was going to be some kind of a normalization deal between Israeli and Saudi Arabia under American auspices, and they would benefit from such a deal and become this kind of the rival to China, but the preferred rival to China in the Middle East. Now, of course, we know the situation is very different, that so many of Israel's Arab neighbors are extremely nervous, extremely wary about what might happen there next. The deal is off the table unless and until there is a Palestinian state, which we know is a remote possibility at this point. So I think the Indian Prime Minister is going to the United States again to try and persuade Donald Trump to be less punitive in his tariffs on India. But we know these kinds of persuasive tactics don't really work with someone like Donald Trump. So I think India, having supported Israel too explicitly in the last 15 months, and not really paying enough attention to public feelings or public opinion in large parts of the non-Western world, has lost out on both moral leadership and also, in a way, the kind of diplomatic leadership that countries like South Africa or Brazil have assumed. And of course, the long-term beneficiary of all this is China.
The author is Pankaj Mishra, and his latest book is The World After Gaza, A History. I really recommend that you read it. Thank you so much, Pankaj, for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Much of the world has become indifferent to Palestinian suffering, and U.S. President Donald Trump is now mainstreaming ethnic cleansing in his comments that he wants all 2 million people in Gaza shipped out somewhere with no right of return, and the U.S. owning the Gaza Strip. We're at a point in history where lessons of the past, especially about the banality of evil, are being boldly and purposely ignored. We know which way we are pointed, and it's not a place where Palestinian justice will be achieved, nor Israeli security. Our conscience as people, once informed by a belief in human rights and dignity, will be deeply stained and damaged by what's unfolding now. And that's the bottom line.